What's the name of the place that he's
It's
at?
Auburn Oaks Convalescent Center. It's
Auburn Oaks,
Huh?
Auburn Oaks.
Auburn Oaks.
It's
Auburn Oaks is where
3400
Shardy's at,
Bell Road in Auburn,
3400.
95603.
And he's on room 123.
2-1.
No,
two,
excuse me,
one,
213. That was close. They may move them though, that's better to
Yeah.
ask if you're gonna go to acid front.
Yeah, Charlie would like to get back
Seems like
down,
every day
or
he's
down
in a
to
different
Roseville.
Yeah.
Charlie would like to be moved down to Roseville area, but he doesn't think it's gonna happen till this week. I don't know if he mentioned the same to you.
That would be nice.
At least it'd be a little bit closer for.
Yeah.
I kinda think we should bring him some books to pass out.
Charlie is a book passer outer, so yes, we should talk to him about that.
You know, I'd like to share something. I had an epiphany the other day. I was reading something and it really hit me how, you know, I love my grandson immensely. And even though he's not paying any attention, he doesn't thank me for anything, he doesn't talk to me, I still love him. And it really hit me that, you know, that's the way God is with us. We wander away, but he still loves us no matter what. He welcomes us back when we come back, and he's always working to get us back. It was just kind of
Don't give up kind of thing, right?
a wow moment for me to think about how, you know, the comparison there.
And how ungrateful we are sometimes for all the things God does for us, right? Some of you already commented about, we're already on Nehemiah 13.
Yes.
And as you guys know, I'm always behind on anything. This time I'm ahead. So for those of you who thought, wait, I didn't study Nehemiah 13, you'll have time to catch up. Nehemiah 13 is power-packed with information. As I was reading Nehemiah 12, and there's some beautiful things in Nehemiah 12. It talks about their celebration and dedication, which is a beautiful story. It also talks about how they cleanse themselves. 13 talks about cleansing themselves too, so we're going to pick up that part as we study 13. But the Lord sort of led me more to Nehemiah 13 because I can't do Nehemiah 13 in one order. I've already have close to 50 slides for Nehemiah 13, and so there's no chance. But I think Nehemiah 13 is huge for us today because, as you remember, in fact, we'll look at the quote. We read this when we first started with Nehemiah and Ezra, and what Ellen White says about how it presents a picture of the work of spiritual restoration that is to be wrought in the closing days of this earth's history. So we are supposed to be in a spiritual restoration. We're not rebuilding Jerusalem. We're not involved in that. But spiritually we are. And we read that in Isaiah too, to build up the waste places. It's in Isaiah 58. So there's plenty of examples in the Bible how important this example of the children of Israel. They were called out of Babylon, just like the three angels' message says in Revelation 14. Call them out of Babylon to serve God fully. That's the call that's going out today. Babylon has fallen, and we're supposed to worship the Creator. So the comparisons between Ezra and Nehemiah and our present day are astounding, and so that's why it's so important to spend time with Nehemiah. And I think chapter 13 is a very good example of those challenges. So I sort of titled this The Three Deadly Sins. And as we go through it, if you take Nehemiah, it breaks up sort of nicely in three different things that the children of Israel were doing wrong. I would submit to you that it's the same thing today with our society, with our churches. So the example in Nehemiah 13, we're going to spend time, how does that correlate to what we do today? And they are deadly sins. they will cause people to lose their way, and we'll study that also. So the first one, and Nehemiah sort of, in my mind, works backwards, and you'll see that a little bit in his verbiage on 13. I would almost suggest what happens, the third deadly sin, probably, and by evidence, would indicate it was probably the first deadly sin, so they're sort of backwards, but we're going to go in the order that Nehemiah did it. So Nehemiah put it in this order, we're going to study it in this order. And you'll find out even the first few verses of Nehemiah, then he goes back and says, but then something else led up to this. So you'll see what I'm talking about as we go through it. But anyway, the temple being defiled is significant. And so we need to look at that. Are we doing a similar thing as what happened in Nehemiah's day? So let's jump into Nehemiah 13. And we'll start with verses 1 and 2.
Keep in mind Nehemiah's civilian.
Nehemiah, yeah, give a little backdrop. Remember, Nehemiah was like the third wave, in essence, of people. He came, he was the cupbearer for the king, and he came in the 20th year. And we don't know how long he was there rebuilding the wall, but through God and Nehemiah's support for God, they rebuilt the walls in 52 days. Again, Isaiah 58 talks about rebuilding the walls. The walls protects God's people from evil influences. That's what walls did back then. Actually, we do the same thing now. They're called fences. We put fences around our houses a lot of time to keep evil from coming in. So it's a similar situation.
They have a wall around his church property.
Now you tend to, it's just the society you live in. So walls are very important because they keep problems out. I'm not referring to anything political right now, but we do it individually quite often. There are some places where there aren't, I don't know if you've been to the South much, but there's not a whole lot of walls there. People aren't so
There's
concerned
no
about
yard.
it.
Yeah, no, they're.
Big rolling yards, and you don't know where one yard ends and another yard begins, but they don't have the crime that you have in the city.
They have real liberal gun laws.
Yes, they do.
Well, that could have something to do with it.
This is true.
But anyway, Nehemiah was gone for a little bit. He came, all this great work was accomplished, everything was put in order. During his absence, a lot of problems occurred. We don't know, I couldn't find where it said how long he was gone. He comes back and is sort of appalled at what has happened to the church.
I was just going to say, talking about walls, Ellen White says that the Ten Commandments are a wall of protection.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, keeps us from doing evil, right? If we stay
Absolutely.
focused on.
Very true, yeah, what you said, very true.
Okay, 1 and 2. Pam, you want to get us going?
On that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God, because they had not met the children of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. That happens a lot.
Yeah. Okay, you may remember we talked about the story how the Ammonites, particularly, it's earlier in one of the chapters that we studied it, where God's people just wanted to pass through. Said we won't take anything on the left or the right, we won't bother with our fields, we just want to pass through and
They said no.
go to another place. They said no. And so ultimately they decided to attack the children of Israel, and God gave them a great deliverance from the Ammonites who were going to attack them.
Are you going to say who they are?
Yeah, we're going to get to who the Ammonites and Moabites. And this is a pretty strong comment that is said, that God basically said through Moses sometime back, I think it was through Moses, we'll find out, that they should never come into the assembly of God. They're not to be leaders, in essence, of your church,
Yeah,
of your group.
and it says forever.
Yeah, forever. Good Monday.
I was a little bit surprised by the statement, because it's in the Bible, and he's quoting the Bible. But this quote is from Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 through 5. where it says, no Ammonite and Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord, none of the descendants, even to the 10th generation.
Wow.
But he interpreted ever.
Yeah.
And 10th generation, let's say about 400 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and secondly, also in the law of Moses, the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God. I think it's a little bit of a warning to us that sometimes it can be dangerous if we just look at one text and don't take the balance. If we took this literally, we would forbid anyone who is not an Adventist to come into our church, ever. So, yes.
Something about that just bothers me.
Maybe we should find out why.
Yeah.
Let's first start out with,
That's right, yeah.
how did they come about? Who are the Ammonites and the Moabites?
Yeah. You are.
Yeah. Let's go to Genesis 19, 30 to 35.
That's you, Lynn.
Okay. This is 19, 30 to 35.
30 to 35.
We got 30 to 35. And Lot went up out of Zor and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him. And he feared to dwell in Zor, and he dwelt in the cave, he and his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come unto us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. And he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. And it came to pass on the morrow, that the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay yesternight with my father. Let us make him drink wine this night also, and go thou in and lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose.
Obviously a pretty significant problem. This is after Sodom and Gomorrah, and not the way things are supposed to be. But notice the typical thing, we want to do it as the custom of all the earth. That's when we run into problems. We wanted a king. Remember, God said, I'm your king. No, we want a king like all the other nations of the earth.
That was disastrous.
That was disastrous. And then there was an issue with a relative of Lot's who decided to take things in their own hands too. They didn't have the faith that they needed to know that God would find a person for them if there was a person that was good for them. And that was the man, one of the greatest men of faith, Abraham, where God didn't seem to providing him an offspring. So we're going to take this into our own hands, and we're going to make an offspring, and then look at the problems that it caused,
That we still have.
today. And we still look at how this problem plagued them. Let's read the rest of this story in 36 to 38.
Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day.
Both of which caused problems to the children of Israel.
Interesting thing, Ruth was Moabitess.
Which sort of fits in with what Gudmundur said.
Right.
You know, that it doesn't mean you can't be saved, because God wishes that everyone would turn to Him. But it's what you claim you are that makes a difference sometimes too. We like to call ourselves Adventist, I would assume. I know I do. I like to call myself Christian first, because I think that's the most important. and Adventist is the type of Christian. What you call yourself tends to denote what your feelings, your thought processes are, generally. And so if you're gonna claim you're an Ammonite, there are certain things that comes along with. And as we read in Nehemiah 4, one of the leaders of the Ammonites, Tobiah, that we're gonna spend time with, was considered an enemy of God, or at least an enemy of Judah, is what they
A
were
good
considered.
example of what you've been talking about exactly. Ruth was a Moabite.
Yeah.
And yet it's part of the lineage, right?
Yeah, she is the part of the lineage of Christ.
So you gotta understand the comment about they shall not be in the assembly with the context that Christ is trying to convey, which is certainly you don't bring them in a leadership position because of their feelings, but over time, as they lose that Ammonite claim or Moabite claim, because what did Ruth say? She said, I want to be one of your people.
Your people.
That's what made
Your
the
God.
difference.
And
She
Jesus
swore off
came through
her.
that line.
Right,
And she was Moabite.
yeah.
She was a Moabite.
And Rahab was not of Jewish lineage either.
That's
So-
right.
So there are others that they became, just like when you're born again to be a Christian. So when you leave,
You should take on the Christian name, not the heathen name or Gentile name or whatever. Jonathan.
Yeah, I think there's an example of talking about something happening forever and ever. In Revelation 14, the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. But we know that the sinful will not live forever in torment. That they, and I've heard it that it can be interpreted that the smoke will, smoke of their torment will ascend until they're dead, or until they're consumed or whatever. And I think that can apply as well to this other passage where until they are not Ammonites, until they don't consider themselves Ammonites, that's when that time period can go to.
Yeah, I think that's right, because there were some who were said they shall not be part of the assembly to the fourth generation.
Right.
So there were some time periods sometimes put with it, but never should an Ammonite become part of your
and
leadership
Ammonite didn't say, because they weren't born again into.
because of what they claim.
Yeah, I would want to say something. In most of the religions and cultures in India, when they have history about them and there is an importance, so if there was a very important fight, they would say that it went for thousands and thousands of years. But that didn't mean that it went for thousands and thousands of years. It was that it had a very long duration, and I think that is quite similar to what we read in the Bible too.
In fact, do you know of any Moabites or Ammonites? I mean, I don't hear of anybody calling themselves that, but I'm not in that part of the region, so
Well,
maybe
who are
somebody else.
they now? Which people are they? Iraqis or?
Samaritans.
Good question.
Are they
What are they?
Are they Samaritan?
I don't know that you have really Samaritans.
Actually, you still do, because Stu Beaumont was born in that area. They were missionaries to the Samaritans. His parents were, I don't know.
I think they were Syrian.
Cultural borders change, or
That's true. Borders change.
kingdoms change over time, political jurisdictions.
I was watching Discovery Channel and Ammon was actually they're Egyptian.
Yeah,
That's
that's,
what I
yeah,
found.
that's
Is that Amorites or Ammonites?
it's a different,
Ammon,
Ammon?
it's
Yeah.
Amun Ra.
not Ammonites, yeah.
There's Amorites and Ammonites.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Okay. Okay, back to Nehemiah. We're gonna spend a lot of time in Nehemiah, but we will jump ship every once in a while and go somewhere else. Okay, so we know about, before we get to that, they're reading the book of the law, and about these Ammonites, they went and helped them. The thing about, however, our God turned the curse into a blessing. They hired Balaam. If you remember Balaam, he was a prophet of God at one point. But he sought money versus service towards God. And there's a nice story, it goes quite a bit. Balaam and his donkey, all that. Remember that story? He was supposed to curse God's people because they were going to overtake
He asked God
These
3
other
times
people?
if he could go.
Yeah, kept saying, sure, I can go, right, God?
Third time God said, just go.
And all that happened is the people were blessed, and obviously God's people prevailed. But there was an additional blessing that Diane mentioned last night that I didn't remember. But you want to show how the real blessing occurred? Or show
A really cool blessing was that I was reading in Spirit of Prophecy last night how the star, when the star came, the wise men had been studying the stars, they knew the stars, and they knew that star was of significance, so they started reading the prophecies in the Bible, or in their scrolls, and found the prophecy of Balaam, which talked about that. I forget which verse it was in, we were talking about last night, but they saw that, and that made them know that the Messiah was there. So the prophecy of Baal, that was supposed to be a curse that ended up being a blessing, also brought the wise men to Jesus.
Very good.
So it had further implications than what we knew. Verse 3.
Now it came to pass, when they had heard the law, that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude.
If time permits, we're going to read Ezra, I think it's 9. It's supposed to be, I think, 2 weeks from now. Ezra 9 talks about this, how intermarriages, and we'll run across it here, intermarriages had so polluted God's people, God's church, that you had to make a choice. And, we talked about how Hagar was separated from Abraham because of the problems that it caused. It's not something you do lightly, but we'll get into that discussion. But this had happened once before, and we'll read that in Ezra 9, how they had to separate themselves from their heathen wives. And we'll talk about also one of the greatest people, the wisest person, whose wives drew him away from God. So that choice of a spouse is pretty significant. And so that's what they realized here.
I think that gives the lesson that, yes, we should welcome people into our church, but you don't get that, you don't have close relationships when they are not.
Or leadership.
Right,
Both ways.
yeah.
You've got to be careful of who you have, and we're going to get into that too, relationships with in the world. Remember, the Israelites were kept separate. Again, even in this, they were kept separate for a reason. There was nothing that kept others from joining them. But they weren't supposed to go out and become part of the world.
You can go out and witness, but don't become part.
And a good story for that would be the spies of Rahab. Obviously, she had seen what was happening. Those spies, she helped save them, and they were a witness to her. She and her family were saved. So there was a witness to the community.
But they didn't frequent the brothel just to try to convert a soul.
No. Is it still true that Adventist pastors they're not supposed to marry an Adventist to a non-Adventist?
Yeah.
I believe that's true.
It's true.
And it's biblically very, very sound. Unequally yoked in, 1 Corinthians 6, I think it is. So they would be supporting something that God said don't do.
I know that was true in the past, but I didn't know if they were still.
As far as I know, although I think it's become a little more murky, because some people will do it
Not
separately.
in the church. They'll do it not in the church.
Right. Oh, not in the church though.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't change things wholly.
It doesn't make the life happier in the end.
Phyllis accepted my proposal. I've been worshiping with her for several years.
She could see your potential.
Yes. Haven't made it yet. And we drove up to see our pastor, and Pastor Paul very gently explained that I wasn't a member of the Adventist church. And he was a wonderful gentleman. And so I said, well, okay. And Phyllis and I got in the car and we were going to drive home. I said, well, let's just elope, which is what I wanted to do anyway. Let's just go do it. Let's go get married. And somewhere coming down that 30-mile drive from Sandy, Oregon to Portland, Oregon, I was gentled. And I says, well, I can't see anything in the Adventist church that conflicts with my belief in Jesus Christ and what I know about the Bible. And that was my attitude towards it, because I grew up in a church. I was certainly looking at y'all and looking for anything. And so I said, well, I'll go ahead and become an Adventist. And really, it's probably one of the most wonderful things that's ever happened to me in my life.
It's fantastic.
So you made an honest woman out of her.
No, I gave her her heart. I gave her what she wanted. I didn't give her. She, I sensed the disappointment she had that she couldn't have the church wedding she wanted to have with her friends in her church and with her family in her church. And the Holy Ghost just touched me and says, you know, there's nothing that's going to hurt you if you're baptized in an Adventist church.
That's wonderful.
Same thing happened with Glenn.
Cool.
He just, on his own, I didn't even know he was doing it. He just called the pastor and said, I'd like to be baptized.
Studied his way into it.
That's wonderful.
Good. Okay, verse 4.
Now, before this, Eliashib the priest, having authority over the storerooms of the house of our God, allied with Tobiah.
Okay. Again, we're talking about what happened before. Now they're telling what happened before. But what's the problem that you see with verse 4?
Well, first of all, Tobiah was one of their biggest problems.
Thank you.
Wasn't he one of their enemies?
Yes, he was. Very
In
definitely.
Nehemiah 4, it talks about how they offered to help build the wall. And they said no. And so what did they do? They created problems the entire time they were building the wall, to the point that they had to build the wall with a sword in one hand and building with the other.
They tried to threaten him, they tried all sorts of things. I find it interesting that he allied with them. He's not allying with God, he's allying with the enemy.
Right. Is it a good idea to ally yourself with an enemy of God's people?
Well, they mentioned the storerooms there. It makes me kind of think that wouldn't they have been in business together? Is that sort of what was going on?
Well, we'll read further. That's a very good observation. Let's see what the Bible says. We're going to go to 6:18 real quick, just so we get the context of what he's involved in. I want you guys to see it from the
18
Word.
and 19.
Nehemiah 6:18, for many in Judah were pledged to him because he was the son-in-law of that man, the son of Ara, and the son of Jehohanan had married the daughter of that person, the son of Berechiah.
You should do 19
Okay,
also.
well, let me give the context
Okay.
to this. This is where they're trying to build the wall. Tobiah and others are trying to distract them from it. There's a lot of letters going back and forth, but there are people connected to Tobiah, who's an enemy of God's people. Clearly it states that in chapter 4. And so even some of the Judah people have become too cozy with them and started sharing things that probably shouldn't have been shared. But nonetheless, it wasn't. God still protected them. Now, when you look at the son of Era, and we skipped some of the chapters where it lists all the people that came in the first round of people back from captivity, Zerubbabel and the ones he brought. The family of Era was one of those people. So you sometimes wonder, God, why did you put in all these families? Well, so we can know who the son of Era was. One of the first, the founders, you might say, of the New Jerusalem that was occurring.
And
And yet they have this intermarriage going on.
Aaron had brought 652 people with him.
Yeah,
He was a big leader.
so he was a big leader.
And then
Okay, go ahead.
verse 19.
Go ahead.
It just says at the end of it, Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. So Tobiah was not an encourager. He was somebody who was really trying to frighten Nehemiah and ended on.
And if you read Nehemiah 4, you read a lot about that. So just to give you a little bit of an idea how Tobiah is sort of connected into this.
It almost sounds like he was jealous.
Could be.
Here was
course, knowing Nehemiah coming in out of the blue, and he had been in a very powerful position among the people who were there.
Yeah,
That kind of opposition was economically motivated.
there's probably that in it too.
Yeah.
Certainly, everything comes into play.
Mhm.
But yeah, nobody likes a new leader in town that might upset the apple cart in what you've had occur, because they were very upset about the building of the wall. That sent them over the edge.
They had to pay for it.
Because as soon as, yeah, they had to pay for it too, didn't they? As soon as you talk about building a wall, you know, that means your ability, and we're gonna read that too, to get there and conduct business or have relationships gets a little bit more tricky, doesn't it?
Well, and he had been told he couldn't do it, so as soon as Nehemiah went away, then he got into it.
And we'll see how he got into it. But you get that family relationship going.
Yeah.
How did-
Raise the water.
You read that all the time, just in political environments where one king will give his daughter to another king to create this hopeful, peaceful, ally kind of arrangement. But look at the problems it causes in the church.
But when you build a wall, you're walling some in and you're keeping others out.
And hopefully what you're keeping out are the enemies from coming in, because you close the gates at night, bad things happen at night, and you control what comes in and goes out. And we're gonna read a lot of that as it pertains to the Sabbath about that also. And the influences from the outside that were coming into the walled city with the gates open and how they address that.
I mean, we were at a couple forts with our grandkids, and we were up at Fort Ross, and not only were the walls strong, but the house where the family lived, where the children were, everything had double bolts on it in the house to keep the children safe. And I thought, wow, you know, that's kind of like our church, keeping our people safe, using the Bible. And
Okay, we'll cover this again later, but it's important to know this inner marriage problem that occurred. If you look at, and let's read Nehemiah 13:28. I don't know who we're with.
Okay. And one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat and Horonite. Therefore I chased him from you.
Nehemiah did not make mistakes. Nehemiah was passionate. We'll read some of his passionate actions later. So basically your priest, Eliashib, his grandson's wife was related to Sanballat. Sanballat and Tobiah were a couple of the principal antagonists. And yet you allowed them to be married. Now he's of the priest line too, so your grandson's wife should have never been his wife. But it was, and look at the problems it caused. And we're gonna read some of them now. Nehemiah 13:5, so we'll pick up with where we left off.
And he had prepared for him a large room where people they had stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the articles, the tithes and grain, the new wine and the oil, which commanded to be given to the Levites and singers and gatekeepers, and the offerings for the priests.
So what room did he get at the temple?
They stored all the stuff.
all the holy things, really.
Right? This is all the tithes and offerings, the first fruits, and all these things that were supposed to be used to pay for the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers. All that was supposed to be used for that purpose. Let's read 6 and 7.
I was not in Jerusalem at that time, for I had returned to the king in the 32nd year of the reign of King Artaxerxes of Babylon, though I later received his permission to return.
Okay, so
7.
Yes,
When I arrived back in Jerusalem and learned the extent of this evil deed of Elisha, and he had provided Tobiah with a room in the courtyards of the temple of God.
Hey, what's the evil thing that he did?
Well, it wasn't supposed to be in the.
No,
Uh-huh.
the temple was prepared for the Levites.
Okay, so you have a place that is dedicated to the worship of God, right? And you have somebody who's an avowed enemy of the Israelites.
Yeah.
Oh, he was a Samaritan, right? We learned that back in chapter 4. And Ellen White also talks about them being Samaritans. So they were Jews, but they had intermarried with the Assyrians during captivity when Israel was destroyed. So you start getting that blended religion. But didn't they say in chapter 4 we serve the same God and worship the same God?
So at the time of Christ, when he cleansed the temple, those people would have been Hebrew, but not Samaritans, so it wouldn't have been the same issue. I mean,
No, they were Israelites, right?
Right, they were still money changers and people there for commerce, but
The problem wasn't the person then, the problem was the conduct, right?
yes.
So
But
you're
maybe-
not,
Still, this conduct wasn't good.
conduct wasn't good, but what else wasn't good?
Well, he wasn't supposed to be there, he wasn't faithful, I guess you could say.
And in Jesus' time, they had just let things slip so much that it was no big deal to them. Isn't that how, when things start getting easier, I mean, if you do it once, it's easier to do it twice, which we knew you drove him out twice. It's just easier all the time,
Particularly if you're a relative by marriage.
right?
Makes it tougher, doesn't it?
And you're connected to the priest.
Right. The priest set all this up while Nehemiah was gone. So the leadership made this happen, right?
Yeah.
Have we ever done that
Yes.
in our churches? I mean, if you give somebody a prominent office in the church, physical office, what does that denote?
Trust, we hope.
Trust and influence,
Yes.
and someone that maybe you should follow,
Well, look to for example, anyway.
okay? Like what they would say would have more significant influence. There wasn't another building in the city they could have put him up in or outside the city? No, went right to the, yeah,
He
that's
was
where he should have
threatening
been, right? It
Nehemiah,
was.
trying to get him killed.
But look how quick and how easily, it couldn't have been more than 12 years. He came in the 20th year, he came back in the 32nd year. How quickly things changed. And why did they change so quickly? That's what we'll read in 13. Clearly the intermarriages cause that kind of problem. Now don't forget, marriage is also very symbolic, because Christ says his people played the harlot. So could you, maybe not in the religious ceremony of marriage, but in the spiritual setting of marriage, could we be doing a similar thing?
Well, also,
When we allow people to come into our church that maybe aren't part of our church? Does that apply?
What do you
Something to
mean
think
by
about.
allow them to come in?
leadership, teaching.
When you have people, this has been sort of a controversy, and I wonder if it applies similarly here, where we have people from outside our church come into our church and present truth. Could this apply?
Oh, okay, yeah.
I'm just throwing it out there. This is for everybody to decide
Consider
on
to
their
pray
own.
about, yeah.
But when you talk about how do you apply this to present time, is it dangerous maybe to do so?
You may not have been here, but
You
we
mean
attended.
somebody who maybe has a name in the world as a Christian to come and speak at Sabbath.
And isn't,
That would be, in my opinion, that would not work.
I mean, is that similar to what we're talking about here,
sounds
where
like
you
it.
have a,
Because he was a powerful man before Nehemiah, and naturally, his reputation was all over. He was known. Therefore, people respected him.
and then you put him in a position of leadership.
Yes.
You have a spot
And you
prepared
put him
for you.
in the temple, as a part of the temple, his word becomes more powerful.
And I would suggest you put him in a very important place. And we're gonna get to that. It's where the tithes and offerings had been kept.
The other thing, you may not have been here, but our daughters were in a Sabbath school where there were over 100 kids in the Sabbath school class. The every Sabbath teacher was somebody that was not an Adventist. They were from another church. And this was his mission work, is to teach in this class, and was teaching false things. And it was an interesting situation. But again, leadership liked the person, so he got to teach there. The other thing is Balaam, part of his, when he couldn't curse the people, then he said, well, just mix the women, bring the Moabite women in, mix the women with your men, and that's how you can get them to fall. So,
And that was done with the children of Israel
right,
just before they went to the promised land.
right.
And it was far more successful. And Ellen White says that was more of an insidious design than a war would have been, because the men would stand up in a war, you know, they're sort of chivalrous to the death, and they would fight and think they could win and everything, but the women were able to accomplish what war would not accomplish.
So in thinking about that with the church and the woman being in the church, you know, people can bring in these false things from other faiths, and they start getting kind of accepted because it was nice.
Goodman.
I think we need to bear in mind really what was involved here. See, Tobiah was not just a visitor who came into the temple. He was living there. But when God gave instructions to Moses about building the tabernacle, he said, let them construct a sanctuary for me that I may dwell among them. But who was now dwelling among them? In one of the localities. He was a permanent fixture in the temple. He was not just a visitor.
Right.
So I think that's an important point.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, who is in the temple? But Tobiah.
Right.
But who was supposed to be there?
Yeah, God.
That's a really
But the
good
first thing,
point.
but the first thing that would come to the mind of the people, if someone asked who is in the temple, would be Tobiah.
Yeah.
And where do you go if you want to see him? You got to go into the temple.
Yeah.
So it's kind of replacing God in that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So that's, and that makes a difference between a visitor. For instance, I know there was a preacher in England. Some of you may have heard about him, John Stott. He was a very famous. He established this church right in the center of London, and it was so crowded on Sunday mornings. They had to have police in the hallways to direct the traffic for the people going out and other coming in. We gave up. We had a church pretty close to it. We had to close it because there was no attendance. And this man came. He came, for instance, and spoke at Newport College, and that some of his writings they are absolutely some of the best theology you can find. So we need to be careful and make a distinction between some individuals who may not necessarily belong to our denominations. They may have very good truth to present, but they should not become the permanent stature in the church.
I would take it further, because I find nothing in the Bible that the Jews were supposed to have people come into their church to teach them from the outside, as if you're God's people, wouldn't you be given all the message you need to have? If you go with Isaiah 8:20, to the law and to the testimony, they speak not according to this word, there is no truth in them. But I would say sometimes we like to bring in some people where we have that admonition, because most of what they say is good. But just like the devil tempting Eve, most of what the devil said was true. There were just a few things that undermined what they were doing
Cause a little bit of
and how
confusion.
dangerous that is. Let's read from Ellen White in Prophets and Kings. Solemnly and publicly, the people of Judah had pledged themselves to obey the law of God. We read quite a bit of that. But when the influence of Ezra and Nehemiah was for a time withdrawn, there were many who departed from the Lord. How important is leadership? Nehemiah had returned to Persia. During his absence from Jerusalem, evils crept in that threatened to pervert the nation. Idolaters not only gained a foothold in the city, but contaminated by their presence the very precincts of the temple. Through intermarriage, a friendship had been brought about between Eliashib, the high priest, and Tobiah the Ammonite, Israel's bitter enemy. As a result of this unhallowed alliance, Eliashib had permitted Tobiah to occupy an apartment connected with the temple, which heretofore had been used as a storeroom for tithes and offerings of the people.
So that gives the idea that previously it had been used for that, because my concern immediately was, so was he partaking of
He may have been.
the tithes and offerings that were in there?
Okay, let's touch upon that and see what the Bible says about that. Verses 8 and 9.
And it grieved me sore, therefore I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers. And thither brought I again the vessels, the house of God, with the meat offering and the frankincense.
Okay, did Nehemiah call a council together?
He did it.
And he just went and did it, didn't he?
I like how he says, I threw, I cast. He's
He
doing
took
it.
forceful
Yeah.
actions.
And he's saying he did it.
Now,
He
Yeah,
made him
because-
upset.
yeah, how would you like to be?
Right.
I'm fat, dumb, and happy in the temple, and all of a sudden this guy comes back from Jerusalem. Who does he think he is to throw me out? You don't think other people had that same opinion? What is he doing? We're that close to getting Tobiah converted. Have you heard that before? And you drove him out of the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, literally. He
There's a
cast
quote
him
from
out.
Ellen White that we'll talk about that too.
Who's converted who?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the issue.
Who's true?
Okay, so why did the storeroom need to be cleansed?
It had been
Defiled.
hallowed when it was built to the purpose of God,
Yeah,
and it became defiled.
defiled by what?
The very fact that he was in there
Okay,
and as a permanent fixture,
and should not have been,
and should not have been.
right? But he was real close to serving the God of the Jews. You'll find out that a lot of their beliefs were very much the same. In fact, Ellen White talks about it. They just had their little bit of idolatry going on, just a little bit.
It's those little bit.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
I go back to the serpent and
Yeah.
you know, just that, oh, do you really think that God would do that? You know, doubt,
Yeah.
that little bit of doubt put into Eve's mind that what God said was not true.
So the most dangerous thing is 90% truth and 10% error, right?
A little bit of poison will kill you.
Just a little bit of poison is all it takes.
Starts
But I
to-
don't understand why the Jews put up with this, because this man had caused them all kinds of grief. So why are they letting him, I guess it was because of the influence of the high priest.
The
It didn't
influence
happen
of
the
the
first day
leaders.
Nehemiah left. It took a little while.
Well, yeah, that's probably true.
It may have been a couple few years, it's hard to know how much time there was, but it wasn't long. But how quickly do we forget what we learned sometimes? I mean, these folks are no different than we are. We're the same. How quickly can we forget?
Satan clouds our minds and our judgments similarly, where we cannot see what is happening, where everybody else can see that.
Yeah.
And he may have been a nice guy.
Yeah, we're
You
gonna
know?
question whether he's a nice person. Usually don't get to leadership
Nice.
position by being terrible person.
Nice people don't threaten the governor and terrify them.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, sure, huh? There's another reason why the temple needed to be cleansed. And I think it's one of the things we actually forget quite often. And it doesn't hurt to refresh our memory on this. Remember what the purpose was for that room. And I like what Goodman said. The building was dedicated to the Lord. It was holy. It was a place you're supposed to meet God.
And also a mark need to be made in front of the public that this was very sacred and the acts have made it defiled, and now it need to be redone so that God's presence can be. So
Sometimes
that
you
action is very, very.
You need to make a visible
Yes, yes.
statement.
Yes, you said it right.
Yeah, no, I agree.
The tithe of everything from the land, whether green from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord.
So what is the tithe?
Holy.
Sometimes I think we forget that in our churches. We had that come up, I don't know, probably 15 years ago at a church I was going to, how we weren't treating the tithe with enough respect and the offering when we collected it in the church. I think sometimes we forget that we should not treat it as a common thing. It is holy unto the Lord. I think the most respectful church I've ever been in, around here, it was elsewhere, where actually after the offering was collected, it was taken to the front of the church and prayed over. And I thought that puts in people's minds how holy the tithe is, because I don't think, many of us remember, read about, or whatever, how the tithe is holy to the Lord. When that money gets placed, probably when it is pulled and put in your hand and then placed in the offering plate, that is holy to the Lord. And you can't treat it anything holy in a common way. John?
Yeah, that's actually what I'm used to, that after the offering is taken up, they bring it to the front and they have prayer. And I don't know if it's certain region of the US or what it is, but later, as I've moved to different churches and stuff, it seems to have stopped happening.
In
Seems
India,
like
it happens all the time. Means in any area that the offering prayer is done after the offering is collected and is being taken in front of the altar and prayed for.
It's a beautiful thing to do. It puts in the minds of the people. But I think as time passes, we start forgetting about its holy nature. So not only was it in a holy place, it was a holy item too. And he was intermingled with that too.
One reason I know it has happened within the church that it has ceased was that a couple of times, I remember in my lifetime, that as this offering was being taken up, there came robbers into the church, and they took all the offerings once it had been taken. So those churches took it up, that immediately when they're taken up, they go behind locked doors directly with the offering.
That must be,
So that I know
Some
that's
cultures.
one reason why many churches are not doing it, bring it up to the altar after the. But I'm not should be,
Right.
we have to do.
Right.
But I know that for practical, that's one reason.
Sort of funny, some of the churches I've been to, if you were, and I worked in this field for so long, if you really were smart about it, you would wait till the person who collects the money. It's not hard to figure out who that is.
Thanks.
Who actually, who actually takes the money away from church. Whether that, or takes it to the bank on a given Monday at a certain time, the same every week, makes you the most vulnerable, because
I
at
always
least in
change the
church,
times when I did.
there's a lot of people, a lot of witnesses, and a lot of things that could go bad. But when people leave wherever that room is, go out to their car, and I'm not talking about here, I'm talking anywhere, and I've seen it at other places. They go to their car, they go to the bank at the same time every week. It's just as dangerous. What maybe should have been done instead is, and I feel pity for the people that steal God's holy money, because that's just not going to go well for you.
No, it's not.
Maybe other arrangements should have been made, but I appreciate what you're saying, Goodmother. Sometimes we change things for those few instances, which aren't the norm, considering we probably collect thousands of churches every day without incident. Oh, every week, excuse me.
I would submit that if we continue to pray over it and not be careless, but at that point, is it God's responsibility?
Yeah. It's God's money at one point. We need to be smart, though.
Right.
And, you know, that I've had some battles with treasurers before over this issue, not here. Not here. Somewhere else, where somebody brought to my attention some of these things that would occur. And it's like, you can't do this.
One person would actually put it in their car and go back into church.
Yeah. Oh, no. And the only people that counted it were the husband and wife. So there's all kinds of things that you need to evaluate to make it happen properly, and people don't know most of this.
Walter does. Walter's been wonderful about keeping us up.
There are checks and balances that the world does as a good business practice that we were able to make sure occurred then at the church.
Yeah.
Because really it's protection for the person too. Because if offering is down, you don't want them looking at you and say, why's offering down?
Why do you have a new car?
Yeah, exactly. Even though it's legitimate, questions arise, and you should help people not to be in that position. But anyway, the concept is the offering is holy. So we need to make sure that when we collect it, we treat it in that regard, and that people know that it's holy. Because that's what the Bible says.
I used to count offering, and before we would count, we'd always have a little worship and prayer, because it's God's money, and we did want to make sure it went always where it was supposed to go.
Can't pray too much over the offering.
No. We need to go.
We do. Let me see where,
You-
if we can break at a nice place. I told you 13 would take a long
We're
time.
past breaking.
Where are we at?
10 and 11, Nehemiah 13.
Okay, we can probably stop there.
Okay.
Oh, no, we gotta do,
No, babe.
yeah, no, we gotta go a little bit further. Just real quick, because it answers Pam's question. Not only had the temple been profaned, but the offerings had been misapplied.
Okay.
Now, we don't know what that was exactly, but you sort of wonder. And it had another thing. This had tended to discourage the liberalities of the people. They lost their zeal and fervor and were reluctant to pay their tithes. God never gives us an excuse for not paying tithe, even under these circumstances. The treasuries of the Lord's house were poorly supplied. Many of the singers and others employed in the temple service, not receiving sufficient support, had left the work of God to go work elsewhere. So did it have an effect?
And that's brought out
Yeah.
in verse 10 and 11, or especially verse 10, how they had gone back to the field. We did not do that.
I meant to do that. 10 and 11.
But since it's 10 to 11, we need to go.
Okay. We'll pick it up there. Thank you for pointing that out. Bonnie, do you mind offering our closing prayer?
As long as I feel safe here.
Yeah.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for another hour to grow. Thank you for more time to learn about you and what's important to you. Thank you that we all feel this is a safe space where we can talk. And thank you for this beautiful day that we're getting to enjoy. To be with our speaker today and all the people who participate in this, our home church that we love so much. And thank you again for the chance to learn. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.